COVID-19 is going to be like 9/11 is for many of us. It's a marker in our story for those of us that were alive at that time. We talk about before 9/11, when 9/11 happened, and after 9/11. Similarly, COVID-19 is going to be like that for all of us who are alive right now. We're going to talk about before the coronavirus, during the quarantine, and after. It's going to mark the story of everyone who is alive. And it is a time of lamentation, of grief, of mourning, the feeling of loss and fear. Is that even healthy? Is it mentally healthy, spiritually healthy? Is there an appropriate response? I think there is, and I'd like to suggest some ways to think about it from the book of Lamentations. I call these 5 keys to healthy lamentation. St. Paul, the apostle, wrote in Ephesians chapter 5 this admonition: look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, or redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. When he said evil, he's not talking about a moral evil exclusively, although that certainly is included in his understanding of the word evil, but it's talking about bad times. And how do we respond in bad times? How do we behave? How do we think? We want to know what the will of the Lord is for us. There are clues for us in Scripture that we can seize and apply immediately during this time. Whenever something this huge happens, you know, people do respond. And if you follow social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all of the other platforms, you're going to see all kinds of responses. And one response is humor, and that's not all bad. Humor has a way of kind of lifting our spirits and giving us kind of a fighting will. And you see some funny memes that are out there, but at some point humor is going to dry up. And when it's your mother that has passed away, or your dear grandfather, or you've lost your job, at some point humor just doesn't work anymore. Another response is fear-mongering and conspiracy theories. And boy, they are out there like crazy. I don't want to waste time reiterating some of those things because I don't think it's really important. In fact, I kind of follow as a guide for myself something that the ancient Hebrew prophet Isaiah said in chapter 8 of his book, verse 12. He said, "The Lord spoke thus to me with his strong hand upon me, and warned me not to walk in the way of the people, saying, do not call a conspiracy all that people call conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread of what they dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread." So let's not be governed by all of these conspiracy theories. Let's actually take the opportunity to respond in a way that is healthy spiritually and mentally. We need something that is better than the triumphalism of naysayers who say, oh, we'll be over this in no time, or we'll just go back to work whenever we jolly well please. And we want something that's richer than the saccharine optimism of people that think that the only response to anything is to think of the most bright and happy and sparkly answer, because that too will be insufficient. In fact, optimism, that kind of optimism, can be deadly. Have you heard about Commander Stockdale in the U.S. Navy during the Vietnam War, who was a prisoner of war for over 5 years? And out of the several thousand prisoners of war, fewer than 600 actually survived that length of time. And he was asked, well, what was the difference? What did the others who died have characteristic about them that you survivors did not? And his answer was instant and without hesitation: optimism. He said, optimism. These guys kept saying, by Christmas we'll get out. Come on, guys. Christmas would come, they wouldn't get out. by Easter we'll get out. Come on, guys, hang on by Easter. I know we'll get out. Easter would come and they would not get out. By July 4th we'll get out. July 4th would come and they would not get out. So they'd have these peaks of anticipation and crashing despair over and over again, and they eventually broke under it and did not survive. But the realist, who accepted reality, embraced it for what it was, not with a morbid despair and pessimism, but who were realistic about the kind of people that they were captured by and the situation and the realities of war and so forth, those men got stronger and stronger during their wait, and they ultimately survived. So lamentation is not despair. Lamentation can be very realistic in a way that fortifies us. One Christian theologian during the Cold War, when everybody was stockpiling things and people were in constant dread, wrote this: "Only a Christian who does not allow himself to be infected by the modern humanity's neurotic anxiety has any hope of exercising Christian influence on this age." End quote. Modern humanity's neurotic anxiety. That's what we want to avoid. Lamentation is not that. What is lamentation? Lamentation is being overtly sad, recognizing the feeling of loss and sadness. And it can be very small and something that's seemingly insignificant, like breaking a dish that was sentimental to us, or huge, like the loss of a child. It can be very particular and localized, like a child in the neighborhood whose dog is run over, or it can be global, like the coronavirus. Lamenting is a part of life, and it's something that all of us will experience, and there are times when we have to actually set time apart and engage in the business of lamenting that show the appropriate response to the Lord our God and to those people around us for what is happening to us. The Book of Lamentations is actually 5 poems that I'm going to read right in the middle of that book, so the middle poem, and I'll actually talk about structure in a minute, but I want to read some words right away that I think will guide our thoughts for the 5 keys to lamenting in a healthy way. In fact, I'm going to title this talk, 5 Keys to Healthy Lamentation. Right in the middle of the poem that is in the middle of the Book of Lamentations, we have these words: "My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me, but I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bear this yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may be yet hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. But though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. For he does not afflict from his heart, or grieve the children of men. Who has spoken, and it came to pass, unless the Lord had commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that good and bad come? Why should a living man complain, a man about the punishment of his sins? Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and hands to God in heaven. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven." The first key to healthy lamentation that I want to share with you is this. Number 1, embrace the power of silence. Be still and hear things you've never heard before. In his fantastic book, Rediscovering Silence, Finding Your Life's Music in a World of Noise, Will Gray recounts the story of Jesus silencing the storm when he was in the boat. And he says there were 2 miracles that actually happened. two remarkable miracles. The one that we always think about, Jesus silencing the storms and saying, "Be still," and the storm responding to him. But he says, quote, "The shocking part to me has always been that it's in the middle of this storm that Jesus is so at rest that he falls asleep." Jesus could silence his own mind and body enough to fall asleep in a terrible tempest. The French philosopher said that Blaise Pascal said that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inabilities to sit in a room quietly and alone. And C.S. Lewis said, "Inner silence is for our race a difficult achievement. There is a chattering part of the mind which continues until it is corrected to chatter on even in the holiest of places." We have a hard time being silent. And yet this is one of the directives that the writer of Lamentations gives to us in his poem. Verse 28 of chapter 3, "Let him sit alone in silence." I love what George Eliot said about silence. She said, "If we had a keen vision and feeling of all ordinary human life, it would be like hearing the grass grow and the squirrel's heartbeat, and we should die of the roar which lies on the other side of silence," end quote. In other words, we would hear things that we've never heard before. When the virus broke out in Wuhan, China, a woman was blogging about her experiences, and I'm sure a lot of it was censored, but one particular piece is so beautiful because it was filled with praises of all the different things that she heard. And one of the things that she learned about was what she heard in a town reduced to silence. She said, quote, "Right now I hear birds outside my window on the 25th floor. I used to think that there weren't really birds in Wuhan because you rarely saw them and never heard them. I now know they were just muted and crowded out by the traffic and people. All day long now I hear birds singing. It stops me in my tracks to hear the sound of their wings. Spring in Wuhan is absolutely stunning. God has been giving us glimpses of the beauty to come with near perfect weather. Because of lockdown, we get to watch spring slowly unfold right in front of us with no work, traffic, pollution, or other distractions. I have pulled up my chair and am ready for the Creator's show." She is hearing things she never heard before because of silence. There's a story of a prophet in the Old Testament that was wanting to hear the voice of God. And he looked for it in the wind and it did not come. He looked for it in fire, it did not come. And in an earthquake, it did not come. But it came to him in a still, small voice. You know, we live in a noisy world, in this attention-grabbing world that is trying to make our minds clamorous. We need to learn how to silence our cell phones, cut off all internet for an hour or 2 hours every day, take a walk with no AirPods or earbuds or listening to music, and just try to silence our souls, and we'll be surprised at how God speaks to us. Silence is golden. The second key to lamenting in a healthy way is a little bit more complex and theoretical, but hang with me. Recognize the power of form. Go deep and wide in what you read and listen to as you've not done before in order to empathize and feel what you've never felt before. I gather this from Lamentations by its very structure. I think that the structure of the Bible is in itself revelatory. It tells us something. Most of the Bible is given in narrative and in story because we can understand story and feel story and remember story, but a lot of it is given in poetry. And the book of Lamentation is so structured as poetry that is why some people thought that Jeremiah actually didn't write it. The structure is perhaps one of the most striking features of Lamentations. There are 22 verses in chapters 1 and 2 that correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And each verse is composed of 3 lines. Chapter 3 has 66 verses of 1 line each, and the first 3 verses begin with the first letter of the alphabet, so on, till it goes all the way through the Hebrew alphabet. Chapter 4 again has 22 verses of 2 lines, and the first word of each verse begins with the consecutive Hebrew letters. And finally, chapter 5 has 22 verses, but there's no acrostic and it's chaotic. And because of the structure of the first four poems, people know that this was intentional, perhaps to illustrate the chaos that is going on in the suffering of humanity. But structure and form are intentional. The method is part of the message. The form says something, and it takes a form that can carry something weighty and substantive. And a lot of the forms that we've gotten used to in our music and in our literature can't carry heavy thoughts. They aren't substantive. Film is a form, for example, but it really can't even carry the weight that music can carry. And then, of course, there are all kinds of forms within music itself as a category. There's a Russian proverb that says, pain is the fountain of art. And in this time of lamentation, there's going to be a lot of artistry that is created, that's new for us. But while we're in it, here's an opportunity for us to find words and to find forms that really can carry the weight of our soul. I think God designed art to be that way. One time when the United States of America was in great lamentation was when Abraham Lincoln died. He was suddenly assassinated, and people both in the North and in the South were grieving. In the North because their leader, who had successfully won the Civil War, was suddenly shot dead, and he had been able to keep bickering political generals in line. In the South, they knew that though Lincoln had been their enemy, he was a compassionate man and wanted to reunify them, and now harder and bitter people might be coming to power, so everybody's grieving. And there was great fear. Walt Whitman wrote a poem that instantly became an American classic and was recited in grade schools all over the nation. Even when I was a kid, we learned this poem by heart, which I can't remember by heart, but I want to read just one line of it. You ought to take it out and read it out loud yourself. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. The metaphor, the form, the rhythm, it all has this ability to carry something heavy and substantive. If you have more time, go to classic pieces of literature where God has ministered to humanity through these people, even though they may not be believers in God. Read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the unabridged 1,300 pages, and enter into that long story and feel the grief of the masses. Or read Wendell Berry, one of my favorite authors, and learn to feel the groaning of the earth. I love Jaybird Crow as one of his books. And perhaps this is another great favorite, Michael O'Brien, Island of the World. Read some of these works that will take you deep into the feelings of humanity and learn how to empathize. We as men particularly need to engage in stories in a deep way so that when we hear the stories of people as they tell us their life stories, we'll be able to mix that story in with all of the stories that we have felt and our own story that we feel, and have empathy for them like we've never had before. I think that God gave us scripture in different forms to show us that forms themselves have a message that say something, and he gave us lamentations in poetry, in art, to show us that there is a way to both express and to feel by the expression of others things that are deeper and more human than we are able to do on our own. Thirdly, the poem says, "It is good for man that he bear the yoke in his youth." This is the third key to lamenting in a healthy mental way. Bear it as a young person. Now that's easy to do if you're a young person, you already have that advantage. But for those of us that are not so young, we need to think of this fact that we have a future and this is going to affect us and our future in a positive way if we choose. It is good for a man that he bear the yoke in his youth. And a yoke is an instrument of submission and oppression and guidance, things that we want to go out and party, but we can't because we have the yoke of quarantine on us. It is good that we bear this in our youth. Why? The children who grew up in the Depression, those who were born in between 1900 and 1927, are often referred to as the greatest generation. And their children, the so-called silent generation, share the same characteristics because they all lived through the Great Depression. They are known for their frugality, they are known for their work ethic, their resilience, and they really should be respected. But what marked them, what they had in common, was a great time of national suffering in their youth. And if we choose to say to God, God, I agree with you, it is good for us to bear this now, because our future, we will be wiser, we'll be deeper, we'll be more mature. There are some kids that were frolicking on the beaches in Florida. Some said some very stupid things, and already they have publicly recanted those stupid things and have apologized, ashamed of what they did already. Don't you think that those kids are going to be so much wiser 10 years from now, 20 years from now, because they bore this yoke in their youth? We can actually say to ourselves in this time of lamentation that this is a good thing for us to bear, because I'm 50, but Lord willing, I'll be 60 and 70, and I will be a better 60-year-old and 70-year-old because I bore this in my 50. And those of you that are young people, it is good that you bear this in your youth. So I think a third key to lamenting in a healthy way is to recognize that your future will actually be better if God gives you survival and God brings you through this. Your future can actually be better because you will be better having submitted to this yoke in your youth. Number 4, remember the purpose of contemplation. Look at verse 40 of chapter 3. He says, let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. All of the philosophies and all of the, I should say most of the philosophies and certainly all of the major religions have this in common. That the purpose of meditation and the purpose of contemplation is to examine ourselves. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. But Marcus Aurelius, the Roman general, said this, how much time he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or things, but only at what he does himself to make it just and holy. And he's not thinking in our Christian terms of justice and holiness, but he's thinking of good and right and ethical and with integrity so that we can be a better person. This is ultimately the goal of contemplation. But God, the creator of the world, had a goal even further than that. Not just being a better person, but he says, test and examine your ways so that you return to the Lord. Marcus Aurelius also said that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. And how we think is how we become. And if we are not regularly examining why we do things and how we respond, then our soul will be colored in a way that we don't really want it to look. I think that the people who actually do this kind of self-examination and who are creatives may come up with some wonderful things that are just soul-stirring and help so many other people. But I think it's also true, as David Bentley Hart said in The Experience of God, that right now we are impoverished. So, well, let me read his quote. We excel in so many astonishing ways at the manipulation of the material order, medicines and weapons, mass communication and mass murder, digital creativity and ecological ruination, scientific exploration and the fabrication of ever more elaborate forms of imbecile distraction. And yet, in the realm of the quote unquote spiritual achievement, the arts, philosophy, contemplative practices, ours is an unprecedentedly impoverished age. End quote. We're impoverished right now, but maybe, like the Russian proverb says, pain will be the mother of art. And maybe people who have reflected will actually, if they don't write a poem or write a song or make a painting, maybe they will create and craft a life that is more beautiful than it would have been before this time. The purpose of contemplation is self-embetterment, but even more so, a return to the Lord. And that leads me to the fifth point. Pursue the reward of hope. Reset, renew, repent. Scriptures say, let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God. When the writer spoke of his sorrow, he said in verse 20, my soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. Have you ever had a sorrow that is just with you and it doesn't leave? It just is the first thing on your thoughts when you wake up in the middle of the night. That kind of deep, heavy sorrow is something that can just weigh down on you. But he says in verse 20, then I think about, then I remember. So when my soul is constantly dragged down into this sorrow, this I call. It's an algorithm. When this happens, then this will happen. When I start feeling very fearful about coronavirus, then I will call to mind these truths. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And he says, when I do that, I have hope. There was a time when I actually struggled with believing in God. But I can tell you that times of lamentation have actually been a beautiful realization. In other words, lamentation can actually be an occasion to get to know God. Do you know God? Hebrews chapter 11 says that without faith it is impossible to please God. And what is faith? Faith is believing that God is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. I can testify that I have gone through terrible, dark times of doubt and despair, and I sought God, and I have found the mercies of God to renew themselves every day, even though I deal with a chronic sorrow. And I have experienced God, and I know that he's a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. You'll start to know that God is steadfast in his love. Chapter 3, verse 22. His mercies are renewed every day, the same verse. He is good to those who wait on him, verse 25 of chapter 3. Those who wait on him, those who seek God, will find him. Romans 8:28 says, all things work together for good, but not for everybody, but to those who love God and are the called according to his purpose. You'll find that he is sufficient for your happiness, and you'll find that even with all of these losses, strangely enough, you can say, like the poet said in Lamentations, the Lord is my portion. So, we have many more weeks of lamentation in front of us. Let's not become depressed. Let's not fall into despair. Let's take 5 keys that are in these poems, and there's many more. I'm just giving you 5. Embrace the power of silence. Be still and hear things that you never heard before. Recognize the power of form. Go deep and wide in your reading and hearing so that you'll be able to empathize and feel like you've never felt before. Celebrate the advantage of your youth. Be meek and patient and submit to the yoke that is placed upon us. Remember the purpose of contemplation, which is to be a better person, to be a better human being, And most importantly, to return to the Lord. And finally, the last key, pursue the reward of hope. Repent, reset, renew, and get to know God. If we do this, we can lament in a way that will actually bring deep joy to our souls.